Thanks for the rousing success of my conversation with Matthieu Pageau recently. I wanted to do a follow-up video based on a comment where we're talking about the knowledge engine model and how that plays into, we'll say, explaining the propositional tyranny. So just a word of explanation in case you haven't seen the model engine knowledge videos before. I have a live stream, and then of course we have the original, which is a little out of date, but it's close enough. This model was developed and designed based on John Vervaeke's 4Ps of knowing. We think we needed to make some modifications to that. What he's describing is information, not knowledge. This thing about the perspectival seems a little bit more primal or lower level. So we changed that, out of the realm of information and sort of beneath it. And then we've just have two types of knowledge that are a result of the four types of information. Those are the 4Ps. And it all starts with signals coming into your awareness, we'll say, and that gets filtered up through the system. And the reason why we think it works this way is because this particular model is very explanatory of the world that we see. So how does this knowledge engine model explain the propositional tyranny? So in order to demonstrate this, let's go to the slide and see what we can learn. So basically what we have, again, is a perspectival framing at the bottom. This is where signals are coming in, and then those signals coming in are being informed in this reciprocal process up and down. It's cooperative processing we're calling rationality, right? We're using a sort of Ian McGilchrist-like model of left and right brain, and then we're dividing things up in order to explain the bias in the system. So what seems to be happening with the propositional tyranny is that you're focusing on propositions and procedures rather than participation and the poetic or parabolic. We used to use parabolic, we've updated it to poetic, in order to create your types of knowledge. Now, there's only two types of knowledge, particular and intuitive. Particular knowledge is sort of knowledge about something. So I know when I put my hand near the stove, it burns. Whereas intuitive knowledge is more like, that thing looks red. Maybe it's hot. Right? You don't know because you haven't been near it. Right? So if you see a glowing red asteroid that could be an alien spaceship, your intuition tells you maybe you should avoid this. It might be dangerous. It's that sort of thing. Not to get too conspiratorial. So those two types of knowledge help you do different things and interact with the world in different ways. And there's a hint to this. So what we've done is we've divided these 4Ps of information, propositional, procedural, participatory, and poetic, into two basic types. So propositional is roughly objects. It's something that points to something, we'll say, concrete or exact. And in that way, you can describe things. So you can say brown hair. Brown is pretty explanatory and hair is pretty explanatory. Those are nice propositions. We deal with them as objects. I don't want to use the word things. That's a little overloaded. They don't have to be strictly, we'll say, objects. Brown is not an object. It's a property of an object, but it's still a proposition. And then there's a navigation of a proposition. So what do you do about a set of propositions? Well, you have to use them in some way or connect them in some way. That would be the procedural, we call it navigation. That's one way of looking at the world. You can find a problem, break it down into smaller parts, for example, objects, parts, and then connect them in different ways using procedures. Okay, so you might connect color to hair. That's valid, right? You don't want to connect fire to hair. That doesn't really make any sense. Now, you can tell somebody their hair is on fire, but that's not the same as saying their hair is brown. Hopefully that's pretty clear. On the other side, on the more intuitive knowledge side, we have this participatory, which is more about movement, or maybe interaction is a better term here. And the poetic is the navigation of that interaction. So an interaction itself is not a navigation, right? So in other words, you can take a ball and throw it. Throwing the ball is a random action, effectively. The navigation of throwing the ball, suppose you're a pitcher, there's a limited number of ways you want to throw that ball. That would require poetically informing how you throw the ball. So that is an example of participatory and poetic working together to create a result. And of course, that result is imprecise. I don't know if you've ever watched baseball, but the pitching is, they don't get it right as often as you'd like. If you want a good pitcher, go for a knuckleballer. That interaction is fundamentally different in both description and physical interaction with the world, or participation with the world, from how you do things propositionally and procedurally. Now, I think the problem that we have is that they're easy to swap. Right? You can break down, well, when you go to pitch, you can pull your arm back this far, and you want to step back with this foot, the opposite foot that you're throwing with, right? And you want to do this, and so you can describe pretty much anything in propositions and procedures, right? But that doesn't mean it's transferable. I will never be an excellent baseball pitcher, right? Not that I'm bad at throwing or anything, but it just requires a skill level that I didn't cultivate, and maybe I couldn't cultivate it. I have no idea. I didn't try. I wasn't that interested in baseball growing up, so who knows what might have been. On the other hand, if that information isn't easily communicated through propositions and procedures, what are we to make of this? Well, the best way to communicate such things, and that doesn't mean that you don't talk or you can't talk, you can't use propositions or add procedures to someone's interactions. The best way to learn is through mimicry, through watching somebody. Oh, this is how this particular pitcher throws his fastball, or this is how this particular pitcher gets a curveball, or this is how this particular pitcher throws all of his pitches. And there are different aspects in that. Now, some of that can be described as well, as I indicated earlier, right? But the way to learn it is to watch it and try to mimic it. And maybe you can't mimic everybody, probably obviously so, but you might be able to mimic somebody. And that mimetic, Girard talks about this in terms of mimetic desire. It's a silly way to talk about it, actually. Not entirely wrong, but also not correct enough. This way of interacting with the intuitive knowledge, right? You get an intuitive feel for whether or not your pitches are going well before, we'll say, the ball gets released from your hand. And you'll hear people talk about this sort of thing all the time. They'll say, oh, I knew the minute I let go that I had screwed up, right? Or I knew the minute that I swung the bat that I wasn't going to hit the ball, right? Or they knew beforehand. Why? Because they started out in the wrong place and their intuition figured that out, but couldn't necessarily correct for it. And from a procedural and propositional aspect, it may look like they did everything correctly because the procedures and propositions might not catch, in fact, almost never do, the nuance required to make things work with the proper timing, in the proper way, with the proper flow. I think part of the reason why when John Vervaeke in particular did his awakening from the meaning crisis, and he focused on flow, which is Csikszentmihalyi, who I guess unfortunately recently passed away. The reason why I think that's such a big deal for certain types of people is because of this propositional tyranny. So when people talk about the flow state, I go, well, okay, but that's not really a big deal. Why? Because it's not a big deal for me. I've been training myself to go in and out of flow states all the time. You can look at something like the Pomodoro technique. The Pomodoro technique, although I don't like the time frames he uses, and you just adjust it to your own sort of time frames, that is something that helps you to get into and out of your flow state. Because if you stay in flow too long, it's actually not good for you. It's not good for what you're working on, actually, with some exceptions. I mean, if you're rock climbing, yeah, you want to stay in flow the whole time you're rock climbing, but you still need to take breaks, right? The Pomodoro technique tells you to take breaks during your work, right? It's you get to train yourself to take breaks. It's really easy now with cell phones to do that because they can help you. You can start work, start a timer. I need to take a break now. I used to go get tea or water, that sort of thing. That can be very, very helpful for people. And so that's the sort of thing that helps you mediate your interaction between what we're calling here left brain and right brain processing, right? This discrete processing and continuous processing, right? And so you want to have a healthy relationship between those two things. And if you don't, flow states will seem like magic. Well, flow states are really just being more on the intuitive knowledge side. And it's not that intuitive knowledge is perfect. You don't make mistakes, but you kind of get a sense for them better. And then usually you get a sense for how to go back to rectify the mistake. That's usually how that works. And it's this cooperative processing from the rationality that helps mediate all four of these ways of informing things, right? And therefore form that particular and intuitive knowledge combination that is best for working. So the way you recognize if someone's stuck in a propositional tyranny is that they rely on particular knowledge. What will this look like? This will look like legalism. It'll sound like fundamentalism. It will be a reliance on something that looks a lot like relying on video game rules for things. That a lot of people will say things like, oh, well, there's nothing in the law preventing that from happening. Okay, but laws aren't designed to prevent things from happening. First of all, that's just the wrong way to think about it. Most people don't even know the laws, so that wouldn't work. Right? It already wouldn't work, but you don't know about most of the laws in your country. Almost no one does, even lawyers. Right? So what does that mean? It means they're relying on a set of rules from an arbitrary authority, in this case, the judicial system, if you're in the US, because it's not even the whole government, right? That's 3 branches, it's one of them, to indicate what those rules are, right? But it's not a video game rule. Like, you can jump off the edge of the screen, nothing's going to stop you. There'll be a punishment for it later if you get caught, right? So, boy, that's a lot of iffiness, right? So when people rely on the law, they say, well, that's illegal. They can't do that, or that's illegal. We need to do something about the fact that they broke the law. Right? These are very particular ways of speaking about the world. They don't really account for the fact that most people who break laws don't get caught. Well, what good is the law doing if you're not getting caught? Right? And then a lot of people get caught and then nothing happens to them as a result, because either it's too expensive to prosecute them, or there's just not enough evidence, and the legal system has very high standards. You're not supposed to rely on the legal system. It's a place of last resort, basically. When everything else is broken down, you have to get the mediation of the judicial system involved. This isn't great. So when people are thinking and talking like that in this sort of video game reality way of thinking, they're stuck in the propositional tyranny. Now, are they entirely propositional? Probably not, but maybe, because a lot of people are nowadays. We tend to think of them as autistic. I don't like the overdiagnosis of autism. It seems to be there's a lot of ways to get to autism, and some of them might be physical. That's perfectly reasonable. But just relying on particular knowledge, on propositions and procedures for describing and interacting with the world, where you go like, oh, well, how do I ask a woman out on a date? Okay, well, if somebody has a procedure for that, now giving somebody 5 or 6 procedures, here's 5 or 6 ways to walk up to a woman and say hi. That's a little bit better, but ultimately that should be intuitive, right? You should be able to go somewhere where there are these interactions and watch people do these interactions, preferably a friend of yours who has a high confidence level and is not afraid. But you can find people picking up other people in bars, for example. So you can just go there and sit and watch. You don't need a procedure. And a procedure is inferior because different people, they do different procedures better than other procedures. And on the receiving end, you have the same problem. Some women respond to humor. Some women respond to strength. Some women respond to confidence, right? And you don't know that ahead of time. There's no way to tell, right? Which is why you kind of have to try things and fail a lot to learn. That's how you learn. And so an intuitive approach is where you can kind of tell from the body language, maybe get a sense, right? It's not always going to be right. The other way is not always right either, right? And that allows you to interact. Now, it just so turns out, as I mentioned in the video interview that I did, humans seem to be really complex. And so complex things are best dealt with intuitively because your intuition has a way to tie lots of moving parts together in a way that makes sense. Now, this, of course, has to be developed over time. That's why mimicry is important. Who and what are you mimicking? Right? Because you're mimicking something, probably lots of things, and you should know what they are and who they are. When you learn what goes together and what doesn't, old fairy tales will help, especially the Brothers Grimm's fairy tales and stuff. That will help you to see how things are sort of tied together. Fairy tales use, we'll say, extra high abstraction levels, like wolves that talk and, pigs that have houses that they built. And, these are strange abstractions, and yet they make sense, right? They make sense. They activate your imagination, your imaginal realm, we'll call it. And that allows you to experiment in your head, as Dr. Jordan Peterson talks about, right, with these ideas and figure out how they fit together. This is great training for your intuitive knowledge. It trains your participation in the world and the poetic navigation or linking or coming together of things so that you can make sense of them. A lot of the, quote, sense-making crisis, in my opinion, seems to be due to this left brain processing that people are doing. It's like, well, propositions and procedures can't really describe the world very well. Some things they describe very, very well under certain circumstances, but most of the world they don't describe. You can't describe like how a bee is flying around in the weird sort of nonlinear paths that they do using propositions and procedures. And to the extent that you can, it's boring and unhelpful. It just lacks too much nuance and information about that sort of continuous, circuitous path that bees follow when they fly. Moths, same thing, right? Butterflies, they're all over the place. They're also very beautiful because they're not merely procedural. They're not easily described with propositions. In fact, beautiful things are very hard to describe in propositions. So you can kind of tell somebody appreciates poetry or art, certain types of beauty, right? They aren't necessarily as stuck in a propositional tyranny as the rest of us. Another sign that people are stuck in a propositional tyranny is, we'll say, an overemphasis on the, quote, educated class, right? Or academia as a reference point, as an authority. Academia is great, but it only goes so far. And they can only talk about certain things in certain ways, given certain circumstances. And that there's this famous trope in computing. If you ask the professor if whether or not it matters what order you multiply and divide numbers in your computer, he'll say, no, of course not. And every engineer that's actually done this realizes that no, there's a speed difference. Now that speed difference may not be significant to you, but there is a difference. And so it just turns out that there's lots of little details that don't matter to end result, but they do matter to how you get there and what the impact of that how is. So it might be slower in some cases to do certain operations a certain way in a computer. And that complicated technical reasons why, if you want complicated technical reasons, you have to go to my other channel, uh, where I talk about that stuff a little bit more often. But everything has that aspect. So plumbing has that aspect, right? There's certain cases in plumbing, for example, where you want to route things on a much longer path because it makes certain other things easier, right? And so the straightest possible way to route your plumbing is not always the best way for the plumbing. But also you have to consider all the things around the plumbing as well. And in which case it might not be the best way at all. And this is where people sort of run into problems. When they're not accounting for that, when they're having issues around that, it just causes problems. And they're not easy to solve problems. That's why you need this intuitive way of understanding things, because that gives you the sense making that we're missing. You could have a perfectly good appreciation of poetry and beauty and still have a sense making crisis if you're trying to describe things, especially procedurally, and say, oh, well, the reason why this works is because X, Y, and Z. It's like, well, maybe that's true even most of the time, but it might not be the most important truth, and it might not be the most significant way to think about it. And that's where you run into problems. It's very easy to describe things using propositions and procedures, but you shouldn't privilege them, especially with things that don't really lend themselves to good descriptions. That's where the sense making comes into play. A lot of people using propositions and procedures will make excuses for other people's bad behavior. Oh, well, they're just trying to blot out the sun because of climate change. And it's like, well, it doesn't really matter why. Blotting out the sun is bad. It's bad. It's always bad. Right? I'm not saying there'll never be a condition where we shouldn't try to blot out the sun. Also, there'll almost certainly never be a condition like that in my or your lifetime. So I don't know why we even think about it. So that is a way of sense making that doesn't lend itself to propositions and procedures. I can't explain to you necessarily all the propositions and procedures that are wrapped up in why it's bad to try and blot out the sun. Like the odds of getting that correct are vanishingly small because it's a very complicated set of operations that would have to be done. You don't actually know what you're blocking out, because while we think we have a handle on, we'll say, all of the different electromagnetic spectrum that are getting to us and what they do when they get to us, and by us, I mean the whole Earth, not just humans, we really don't. We really don't. That's just false. And we also don't know all of the effects that would have on other things. So if you cool the Earth, what does that do to the trees? Right? Does the rate of evaporation, the change in rate of evaporation, have an impact on tree survival or plant survival in general? I don't know. What about animal survival? A lot of animals need to cool themselves through evaporation, and if you blot out this, right? So I mean, I could go on and on and on, unfortunately, but like, how much of the propositions and procedures would you need before you come to the conclusion that blotting out the sun is bad? Or you could just intuitively realize blotting out the sun is bad. Like this, it's a shortcut. It's a lot easier. It takes way less time, energy, and attention away from you. if you just intuitively understand, no, blotting out the sun is bad because there's too many impacts, and there's no way science has a handle on maybe half of those impacts. Maybe. I doubt it. There's no way. And so this is a bad idea to take a risk that large. And your risk calculation, which if you read Nassim Taleb, and of course everybody should read all of Nassim Taleb's books, they're excellent. Risk calculations are what we do when we make decisions. We don't do this logical decision-making process. And I'm not saying never, because occasionally we do logical decision-making process, but most of our decision-making is wrapped up in our motion, our breathing, right? We raise our arm. We didn't logically think, oh, I have to raise my arm, right? That's another sign that someone's stuck propositionally. It's when they start trying to describe actions that we just take unconsciously, which we just do. We don't think, I need to raise my arm. We don't think that. It just happens for us. Fortunately, if we had to think about it first, and there's two different parts of your brain that do that, thinking fast and thinking slow, it would take too long. We wouldn't be able to react to the world that we have. That's why we have two parts of our brain, and one reacts to motion and doesn't see objects very well. It sees motion, right? And the other one identifies objects. And the identifies objects thing is much slower than the react to motion thing. That's why you back away when you hear a strange noise in the jungle, which is what you should do, because on average, that will save your life. It's not that hard to figure out. So when you hear this reliance on descriptions, or you hear this reliance on, well, so-and-so wrote a book on this thing, and it's like, well, maybe that's valid. Maybe their book's wrong. I know I've talked about this before. I apologize, I can't remember the author, but there's a book that's being used, or was being used, in Australia. Yeah, it's a teaching device in the schools. The author actually wrote that basically, in northern parts of Europe, I think it was the mid to late 1300s, farms were abandoned and all sorts of bad things happened economically, and we'll never know why. And I told 4 of my friends about this, and before I could finish, they all said it was the plague. And I was like, well, yeah, it was. What is so this guy doesn't know there was a plague? We'll never know why people left their homes and abandoned their farms and farm production went down during the plague. Oh yeah, that's a real head scratcher. Now, I'm not saying the rest of his book is garbage, but that's kind of a big miss, right? That's a big miss. So it's quite possible that either if you missed that particular event, that you're missing a whole bunch of other events that also affect what you've written about, since you seem to be concerned with the economic downturn due to the plague, or one of the many plagues, to be fair. There were a bunch of them. Or you just didn't do good research, in which case maybe the rest of your book isn't really well researched, right? Or maybe you're a little dumb. And if you're a little dumb and you write a book, maybe the book is dumb, right? So there's just 3 ways that I can put up some alarm bells. And again, I'm not saying anything else in the book is wrong, but also the odds are not good. The odds are not good at all, right? And so you kind of have to be able to account for that. So Karl Marx wrote a book, right? And if you listen closely, children will often have quotes right out of Das Kapital, multiple. I've heard this multiple times. It's happened multiple times. I'm like, wait a minute, that's a quote out of Das Kapital. Oh, okay, what does that mean? That means any child can come to the same propositional conclusions as Karl Marx. This is not a good sign for Karl Marx. I'm just going to tell you, not good. Not good. Probably not writing an intellectually stimulating work. Maybe you fooled people into thinking you were. Fair enough. That happens all the time. That's called enchantment. You're probably not writing a work of deep thought. If children come up with some of your most well-known quotes out of your book, when obviously they didn't read it, and in those cases I know for a fact they didn't hear anything about it from their parents or teachers. People generally tend to go around quoting Das Kapital to children. So it's not a good sign, right? And I'm not saying everything that Karl Marx wrote is wrong. Oh, no, wait. I'll say that because that's definitely the case. If you just look at some of this stuff, it's like, okay, right? So, and yet people still read him and quote him and think, wow, this guy really had some good ideas. He's playing a trick. By the way, if you need to know about that trick, I'll link that video here, the trick of socialism, because it's actually an interesting trick that people miss, and fair enough. There's a lot to keep track of in the world. And if you try to keep track of it with propositions and procedures, you're just going to miss most of the stuff, right? If you use your intuition, especially once you train it well, and you do have to train it like everything else, you have to train your propositions and procedures too, right? You have to kind of figure out how logic works and play with it and, bump it up against other people, either in discussions or formal debates, right? Until you get good at it, until you get really good at it. It's the same with your intuitive knowledge. And some people are naturally more intuitive. Some people are naturally less intuitive and more particular, right? This is where the autism comes in. Everybody who relies more on particular knowledge looks more autistic. And there seems to be lots of reasons for that. Lots of, if you're living in a video game reality or you like video games, you think you like video games, you get exposed to that rule set where you're in a smaller world and you seem to have some control over it, and those rules are consistently enforced, right? You're going to treat the rest of your experience that way, or at least many people will, right? They're going to look autistic, right? If you rely on books and people to tell you as authorities exactly the way the world is, and you think, oh, that's exactly the way the world is, and then when it's not, you get upset, you might look a little autistic, right? But those are different causes. Those are different causes. What they have in common, in my opinion, is this reliance on particular knowledge. And that particular knowledge is derived mostly from propositions and procedures and just doesn't have enough participation and poetic navigation in it. So it's very hard to interact with people because people, again, they're just really complex. And the only way out of that really is to participate more. And there are some things you can do. For example, if you're sitting at a desk like I am, and I learned this from Dr. John Vervaeke, actually as part of his meditation course. Meditation is a little hard. Most people won't do it. Most people can't stick with it. Only do it in a group, please. Don't try to go off and meditate by yourself. It's actually not good for you in general. Most people get led astray pretty easily. Sit at your desk, look at an object on your desk, and kind of relate to it. Like, where did that come from? Why did I put it there? When was the last time I used it? In this case, I'm looking at a toy. I don't use toys very often, usually to show children on the camera. But doing that, even just a couple minutes every day, for example, helps you reconnect with the world, helps you to realize the things that are around you are connected to you in some way. Right? I walk out of my yard, there's butterflies and dragonflies and the occasional squirrel and, who knows what else. There's all kinds of animals here where I live. I live more or less in the woods. And realizing that they're here, that the butterflies and the bees and stuff are here because of the flowers, right? And the pond and things like that. It helps to keep me grounded, right? Also, it doesn't overwhelm me. If I try to break everything down into the world when I'm working at my computer, I could do propositions and procedures all day long, right? But they get overwhelming because trying to describe the world that way it just causes a flood of propositions and procedures. Whereas when you're outside in nature and you're sort of interacting with the nature, you're in your sort of flow state, you're in your intuitive mode, right? You're moving around and the creatures are moving out of your way. Usually they're running away. The grasshoppers in particular will start hopping in front of me because they know you're coming. They don't know what's going on, right? Occasionally a deer will skitter away into the woods. That gives you a different sense for the world that you're in, right? And you're in the world. Propositions, procedures tend to abstract you out of the world. So take a minute to connect with the things around you, every day so that you stay grounded to the things that are around you and you think about those relationships to those things. That's the way out. And then if you can do that, talking to people, interacting with people, going outside will get easier for you. Join a book club, start a book club, do whatever it takes to find new people to interact with. Smile at the cashier at the grocery store or the bank or wherever. These things are important. And as we remove them all and sort of replace them with the cell phone reality, we sort of lose the plot. And that to me is very dangerous. So look, I hope that the knowledge engine model helps you to understand the propositional tyranny and identify it, hopefully in yourself and maybe also in others. It can inform you as to how to interact with them better or whether or not they're comfortable interacting, and maybe give you a sense for how to make them more comfortable when they interact with you, which is always good. It's good to try to cooperate with people. We're very cooperative creatures in general. And if you want to see more of this sort of stuff, or you want to know more about this, please comment below. I'll do my best. I can't do everything. I wish I could. I've got about 200 videos in the queue that I would like to do, some of which I could actually maybe do. And we do have more slides. I have to get the slides sort of redone and revamped and think about how to present them all. And I don't actually like the slides so much. Not that I want to rely on talking, but the problem with slides is that people generally get sort of caught up in what's on the slide and they don't get sort of the point, which is to get out and interact and do things with people in the outside world, connect with nature, right? Which is not in front of your computer. One of the things I do is I have an outdoor office. I can and sometimes do drag my equipment outside, and then I'm sitting outside. And when I'm sitting at my desk, I have a window right there, right? So I see half the garden and a bunch of stuff all the time. These sorts of things help again to keep you connected and grounded to nature and the flowing reality and the birds and whatever else flies past my window. That is the important way out of the propositional tyranny. The key to all of this is to be very careful with your time and attention.